Hello. In this video, I'll be going over how to host a game server on TrueNAS using Docker. I'll be using Vintage Story for my tutorial, but this should work for Minecraft and any other similar games. To start off, we will need to create a new user group as well as a new user to manage our resources. So let's head over to TrueNAS UI and head over to Credentials and Groups, and let's add a new group. I'll set the ID as 1000. You can use another ID if you like. I just like 1000 as it's the first one in our range. For the name, I'll do Vintage Story, just so I know what this user is for, and everything else we can leave as is. So let's go ahead and save that. Now that we have our group created, let's go back over to Credentials, Users, and let's add a new user. For the full name, all of this is just going to be Vintage Story as well. And then for the username, I generally will just complete this and also make it Vintage Story as well. Cool. And then for the ID, let's go ahead and set that as 1000 as well. And for the password, go ahead and make that whatever you would like. Cool. So now that we have our new user, we can leave everything else as is. The main thing I'm going to make sure to turn off is the user group, as we've already created a group. And then we just need to go ahead and make sure that we select the Vintage Store group that we just created previously. And then as far as everything else, we can leave that as is. Let's go ahead and save that. Now that we have our user group as well as our user, let's go ahead and head over to Datasets and create the dataset for our service. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a new dataset within my root directory. And for this one, I'm just going to call it Vintage Story. And I will set it as an SMB dataset, just so I can more easily interact and update my server game files later on. You can also do this through SSH directly, but for this tutorial, I'll be using SMB. So let's go ahead and save this dataset. And then the first thing we want to do is, if we look at the permissions, this data set is using our root user. So we actually want to go ahead and edit that. And let's go ahead and update the group as well as the user to Vintage Story for the user and the user group we created earlier. Go ahead and make sure you check the apply checkbox, otherwise these changes won't go through. So once we have the correct user group and user selected, let's go ahead and save those permissions. And we can just verify over here that we do have the new user and user group selected. Perfect. So under this new Vintage Story dataset, I'm going to go ahead and create two more datasets. So one is going to be server, and I'll explain later on exactly kind of why we're doing this. So let me go ahead and do that. And then for these as well, you'll want to update similar to the Vintage Story dataset, you'll want to update the user as well as the user group. So let's set those to Vintage Story, make sure we check apply, and we'll go ahead and save that. And then we'll create one more for data. So this essentially allows you to separate the game data from the server specific files. So eventually, if you have to update the version of your server or any other kind of changes happen to the core files, it ideally won't mess up your actual world data and things like that. So let's go ahead and create this directory as well. And similar to before, we'll update our permissions to use the Vintage Story user as well as user group. So let's make sure those are updated, and we'll save that. Perfect. So now that we have our data sets and everything is using the Vintage Story users, just for a quick sanity check, if you want, go ahead and open your files on another computer that you can access your NAS through. And in my case, if I go ahead and look at my file explorer, if I refresh this real quick, we can actually see that I now have the Vintage Story folder, and as well as data and the server folders. So these are empty for now, but we'll populate these in the next step. So cool, now that that's all working, let's go ahead and go to our apps. And I'll be using Portainer for this just to kind of manage my Docker containers. Feel free to use any other sort of Docker UI that you want, but in this case, I'll be using Portainer. So let's go ahead and head over to our Portainer instance, and I'll be using my just local environment. So within there, the first thing we want to do is create a new image, and this will essentially be the image for our game server. So go ahead and build a new image, and for the name, you can essentially name this anything you want. Just keep a reference of what this name is for later on. But in my case, I'm going to name it Vintage Story Server, and the tag will just be any. If you want, you can tag this with different versions and whatnot, but for this case, I'm just going to kind of leave it as is. So once we have our name, the next thing we'll need is to have the actual Docker image. So I'll have a link in the description to all of these files. If you are doing this for another game, for Minecraft, for example, I'll have a link in the description for some GitHub repos that you can use to find these relevant images and whatnot for Minecraft. But again, in this case, I'm doing this for Vintage Story, so that's what I'm going to use. So just to kind of have a quick overview of this, the main things we're doing in this Docker file is essentially getting our base image. We're making sure that we expose the correct port. And then in this case, I'm also setting the version that I want, and I can update this later on as we'll see in a bit further on in this video. So the other main thing just to point out is we have separate paths, one for the server file specifically and one for the game data. So this is also why we created those separate data sets. And then a bit farther down, we essentially just install all the libraries that we need to run Vintage Story. Just one quick shout out depending on when you're watching this video. Currently the latest version is 1.20.12, but as of 1.21, the .NET version that you'll need is actually 8, not 7. So this script will potentially need to be updated if you're trying to run a newer version of Vintage Story. But for now, this is the latest one, so this is what I'll be using. And then under users, this is where we have that ID of 1000 that we set earlier. So if you did use something besides 1000, please be sure to update that here. Otherwise, this server won't work as expected. So cool. And then the last thing to point out is we actually have an entry point script, which I'll go over a bit exactly what this does later on. But essentially, if you do have, for Minecraft, for example, if there's another script that you use that kind of handles the starting and stopping of your server, this is where you would have to update that. So cool. Speaking of that, before we go ahead and create this image, let's actually upload that launcher script file. So I'll go ahead and add that here. And now that we have that, we can go ahead and build the image. So this process will more than likely take you a couple of minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and skip forward, and just feel free to pause till that's created. Once your image is complete, you should see a similar screen to this one, which just kind of has the general output. So as long as you're not seeing any errors or whatnot, let's go back and check just to make sure we have our image. So if I head back over to images, and in my case, I'll go to the last page, I can see the new image here. So cool. In this case, we're ready to go ahead and create our stack. So let's head on over to the side and go to stacks, and let's add a new stack. So the name for this one is not too important. Just name it something so you'll know what it is. So once you have a name, let's go ahead and paste in or add our Docker Compose file. So in this case, for Vintage Story, Minecraft and other games should be somewhat similar. So I'll just point out kind of some of the key things to keep in mind. First off being, make sure that this image name is whatever name and tag that you gave your image earlier in the last step, and those will have to match. So the container name is not really as important. Kind of name that whatever you want. You can also omit that if you'd like, but I like to have one just so it's easier to keep track of what this is. And And then again, if you're doing Minecraft or another game, make sure that the ports are what you need for that game. And then in this case, one thing to point out again is the volumes. So these is basically binding our NAS volume. So these are the data sets that we created earlier on in the video to the local, um, essentially, data of this container. And again, we have it separated out for the server and the data files just so we can more easily separate those out. So please be sure to use the correct volume path for your system, as it will more than likely differ than mine. Another thing to point out if you are following along for Vintage Stories specifically, please update this version to match whatever latest version you want to be running. And this should also match the version that we had earlier in the image. So perfect. Now that we have all that set up, let's go ahead and deploy our stack. This one, as you can see, is a lot quicker. So once that spins up, let's go ahead and go into our stack and see what's going on. At the beginning, for the first execution, you will see an error. Minecraft and other games should kind of be a similar process, but for Vintage Story, if we go into the container and look at the logs, the reason for this is when we first spin up the server, it doesn't have any files or anything. So that initial iteration is essentially the system downloading and setting up all of its files. And we can see that here where we basically need to rerun the server for it to work. So if we go back into our container, we can essentially just restart it. This time around, if we look at the logs, we can actually see that it is starting our server. And just to kind of check that out, if we go ahead and go back into our file explorer and just kind of refresh this, and if we actually look inside of our data folder, it's no longer empty. We actually now have the server configuration, we have the saves, and all the other directories that contain our world data. And if we head over to the server folder, we can see that we now actually have all of those files as well. So now that we validated that our server is up and running and we can see all the files, the next step and question you may have is how do we interact with it? So um, ideally, especially for a server, you might want to run certain admin commands and things like that. So the way that we do that is through SSHing into this container. Then through that, we can actually run some commands. So in order to do that, if you don't already have SSH access to your NAS, go ahead and get that set up. I won't specifically be going over how to set that up in this tutorial. But go ahead and get that set up if you don't have it, and then feel free to follow along with the rest of the steps. So once you do have that set up, let's go ahead and open a terminal window. And essentially the first commands that you'll need to run is essentially SSHing into your NAS. So in my case, that'll be SSH space root at my IP address. And I'll have all these commands in the description as well, just so it's a little easier to kind of copy and paste those in. So if we go ahead and do that, we can now see that I'm in my NAS. And the next thing we need to do is essentially go into that specific Docker container. So this is also why, in my case, I like to give a name to my container, just so it's easier to remember what it is. So we will basically do that with the following command. And again, this vintage story underscore server is the name of my container. So please replace that with whatever the name of yours is. And if we go ahead and run that, we can see that we're now in our container. And from there, we'll be using screen to basically interact with our server directly. So if we go ahead and do screen ls, we can actually see what screens and essentially what processes are available for us to kind of connect with. And in here, we can see that we have our vintage story server. So let's go ahead and attach it. So if we do screen, and we can just do R. In this case, there's only one, so I don't really have to specify which one. But if you want, you can specify the name in case you have multiple running. So just to show that, I'll do inventory server. And if I screen in, then we can actually see the logs directly as you would see it if you're running the server. And then in this case, you can essentially run things, excuse me, directly. So we are now directly connected to our server and we can run whatever commands we'd like. And in order to back out of this, at least on Windows, it would be ctrl+a,d, and that'll basically just bring you out of that terminal. So awesome. Now that we have that and we have the ability to interact directly, that's pretty much all we need to have our server. So cool. Thanks for following along. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment below. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching.